Hey, just a quick message from Dan to let you know that even though we talk a lot about guitar in this episode, this is still valuable for any musical discipline, being voice, any instrument, and music creation as well, because the principles that we discuss here apply to everything. Enjoy the episode. I'll see you in there. Welcome to the Best Music Podcast, where we see behind the curtain and discover the hidden habits and success secrets of noteworthy music makers so you, the listener or viewer, can speed up your journey to your dream music goals by taking what you need from their wins and lessons learned along the way. I'm your host, Dan Spencer, and this week's featured guest is James Shipway.
In this video, I'm going to give you the ultimate guide on how to learn any new chords. You want your guitar solos to groove like a pro, and stay tuned. Think you can't play great sounding rock solos of your own? Think again.
James Shipway is a British guitarist, author, and course creator who has racked up over 30,000 hours of experience helping guitarists to improve their playing. He shared his knowledge with millions of guitarists worldwide via his YouTube channel and his online guitar academy, Total Guitar Lab, as well as his acclaimed series of No Bull guitar books. James first began playing guitar at age 16. Self-taught and with no prior musical education or experience, he still remembers very well how confusing guitar playing is without any guidance. He brings this personal experience of struggling with adversity and confusion on guitar to everything he does, and in his practical, effective, and easy-to-use approach of learning, playing, and practicing guitar, which has gained him a legion of followers around the world. His book releases include Music Theory for Guitarists, Volume 1, 2, and 3, The Caged System for Guitar, Blues Soloing for Guitar, Volumes 1 and 2, Bar Chords for Guitar, Music Theory for Guitarists, The Complete Method Book, Circle of Fifths for Guitar, and others. In his most recent book, Rock Lick Method for Guitar, James takes the reader on a step-by-step journey and gives them what they need to build a killer rock and metal guitar style of their very own. In his books and in other lessons, James's aim is to break down and simplify seemingly complex theory, techniques, and styles so that guitar players of all levels can see drastic changes in their standard of playing faster than they ever thought possible. To learn more about James's books and other resources for guitar players, visit jamesshipway.com. That's JamesShipway.com. James, thank you so very much for your patience while I read your accolades, and thank you so very much for your time. Come and hang out with me here today.
It's a pleasure. Great
James,
to be here.
Question for you right off the bat. When you were 16, and you wanted to play guitar, and you had a fire in your heart to get after it, tell us about that process of going from, I don't know what I'm doing, I have no clue what's good, no clue what's bad, what we could call a state of unconscious incompetence, and how you brought yourself through self-discovery, through finding different materials, the materials you used, all the way up to now where you are in a state of unconscious competence. You are a master of your craft and also teaching others.
Okay, well, I mean, yeah, it was very difficult. I think I had no musical knowledge at all. I'd never played any instruments before. I knew literally nothing. All I knew was I'd actually just been to see Mark Knopfler from Dire Straits play with the band that he was in at the time. That kind of inspired me. I was listening to Guns N' Roses and Def Leppard and all this kind of stuff, and there was something about it that made me want to play music. My dad plays guitar, but he used to play sort of semi-pro just in a local sort of function band. There was an electric guitar lying around the house, and I kind of used to just plug it in, and I couldn't play anything, but I just pick the strings and hear this kind of distortion and horrible noise, and I was like, there was something I thought I'd like to learn to play something on this. And I don't know if your listeners can relate to this. I put it off for several months because I was afraid I was going to fail at it. I thought, if I tell my dad that I want to learn to play this guitar and I don't like it or I can't do it, I'm going to have to go to him and say, I don't think I can do this. So it took a bit of balls to actually finally say, look, I want to learn to play this. He was having some lessons with someone at the time, and he had a couple of kind of easy beginner type books. They were rock sort of oriented, and I picked one of those up, started playing like a little blues solo in it, and learned some power chords. And I think this book was very simple. There wasn't very much in it, but I think that was actually good because I wasn't overwhelmed. I had like 2 or 3 things I could learn to play. I'm sure they totally sucked, but to me at the time they sounded great, and it was just like I could actually make it sound like something. So I sort of struggled through this little blues solo for probably months. I don't remember, quite a long time, and I'd play it along with the backing track and get the hang of that. And then I started trying to learn the Hotel California guitar solo. Now, of course, I'm talking like this is like what 1992 or something. I mean, of course there's no YouTube. I guess there were tab books, but I lived out in the country in the UK, and I didn't really have a local guitar shop. I wasn't driving, it was hard to get to places. But my dad had lessons with a local guitar player who was teaching him to play the Hotel California solo, and he had the lesson on cassette going through each lick, so I used that. And so I sort of managed to learn to play that. And if anyone listening is struggling learning that solo themselves, when I say learn to play, I don't want them to think that I found it easy or that I made it sound very good. Again, it sounded good to me, but I'm sure it probably sounded awful. But I think, to go back to your question about incompetence, whatever it is, I think that can sometimes be quite a good thing, because it sounded good enough to me. I knew so little that I didn't really question what I was doing. It sounded close enough to me that I thought, yeah, I'm able to do this. And that encouraged me. Whereas maybe now someone might go onto YouTube or something and look at all these amazing players, and almost be discouraged. So I think the having very little information when I started with, and not knowing enough to know that I probably sounded awful, actually was encouraging to me, because I thought, yeah, this is something I could be good at. But in terms of resources, there wasn't very much back then. I mean, I'm really showing my age there. I probably sound really old saying that, but it was genuinely true. We were talking at the beginning before we started this interview. A lot of the books weren't very good. They were confusing. You couldn't go onto Amazon or whatever and just order them. And also when you're just starting out on something, and I think this is really true now as well, is when you don't know very much about anything, it's very hard to actually filter out the good stuff. So you might think, oh, this book looks like what I need, or this is what I want, but you don't really know, because you don't know anything about the topic, that it's not a very good product. And I think this is probably true now with things like YouTube, is when you're starting out and you don't know anything about playing the guitar, you go on and you find a lesson, and you can't really tell whether it's any good or not. So I think there's probably a lot of players who get a bit overwhelmed and discouraged because they're learning using resources which aren't very good, but they maybe don't know that they're not very good yet. So it's but yeah, that's kind of what I did. I struggled along for a bit, and I just kind of kept going. Do you want me to keep talking about what I did find a couple of resources which were really good in the end, actually. So I was reading I guess it was like Guitarist magazine, which was a UK guitar publication, which my dad used to get, and I started reading back issues of that, which were lying around the house. And I remember it had interviews with Zach Wilde after he just joined Ozzy, and like the guys from Skid Row and these kind of bands that I loved at the time. And I found an advert in there, and it was like, there was some books, and one of them was a book by an author called Troy Stettiner, an American guy, and it was called Speed Mechanics for Lead Guitar. And I ordered that, and just to kind of, again, it's kind of funny now, but I filled out the little form in the magazine with my address, posted it off, and said allow 28 days for delivery. I mean, this is mental. I ordered a book on Amazon yesterday. It arrived about an hour ago. So just shows how things have changed. But I mean, and I got that, and I think that was the first kind of resource. And I listened to the came with a cassette, of him playing the stuff. I was like, wow, this guy's a monster player, And it was the first kind of resource I think I had that kind of, first of all, had the kind of examples of the way I wanted to play at that time, which was a rock and metal kind of, that was the kind of the thing I was into then, and actually broke them down and really showed you, well, here's kind of how you can play this stuff, because that's what you don't get from just learning a solo, isn't it? It's very hard to actually see, what are the nuts and the bolts making up this guy's solo, and he broke that down, and I got that book, and I would just practice obsessively doing these exercises, 6 or 7 hours a day, every day. I did nothing else really but that. And I wasted a lot of time because all I was doing was practicing these exercises. I made a lot of mistakes. But I think making that commitment and devoting that amount of time to it is actually really good. I think it kind of showed me, look, this is something I'm in charge of. I can put the time in. I was improving. If I invest the time, I know I can get results. Whereas other things I'd done before, well, maybe there were outside factors which could influence, how well I would do at it. Maybe where you lived or who you knew or this kind of stuff. I was like, this is something I can sit in my room. I've got this book. I can work my butt off on this book, and I'm going to get better. And that's kind of what happened. And I mean, I went on, did lots of other stuff after that. But I think that was probably the most influential thing in my playing, was getting that book and working through it and actually seeing some progress in my playing rather than just struggling with lots of different things, kind of disconnected. I had a bit of a method when I had that book, and I think that's really
I
good
will
thing.
second that story, that my first exposure to speed mechanics for lead guitar, it was a watershed moment. There was like before it, because all the other books I'd ever tried just did not explain how things went down. And Troy was like the first guy. Respect to Troy.
Yeah, no, awesome stuff. And you still see that book around, and I'm like, okay, like maybe some of this, obviously, I guess things have moved on in some ways since then. There's new things he doesn't cover, but I think, like with what he shows you in a book like that, he kind of shows you the process, and I think that's the process is what you need, because if you've got the process and you're listening to good people and you're applying your imagination and things, you've kind of got what you need. You can take that process and apply it to all sorts of different areas, and you can improve that. And I think it's really the process, I think, is the important thing, because that's what's going to enable you to actually progress. The information's all over the place, but getting the process is really important, I think.
Troy's actually releasing a Speed Mechanics for Lead Guitar 2 in a couple months coming up. So
oh, really?
Very stoked for him.
Cool.
He's still at it.
Yeah.
Now,
excellent. You need to get him on your podcast.
Oh, he's been.
Dan. Been interesting. Yes. He's been on it, has he?
Yeah.
Oh, cool.
He's the real deal. He is the real deal.
Yeah.
So, James, you have this exposure, as I did to Troy Stetina, who, I mean, for the first time, actually broke things down in a way that you could understand and you could act upon. Now, within that, and even looking at that sort of stage in your journey, let's talk about technique, because someone can describe technique to you and can show you pictures of technique. How did you find your way to sustainable technique where you weren't developing, because doing 6-7 hours a day, you run the risk of tendonitis, you run the risk of injuring yourself. Talk to us a little bit about that stage in your development, that stage in your process, and then also how you then think about that now, translating it for your students.
Okay, well, I think partly my ignorance about the whole thing was, I was very much like, if I practice everything in Troy's book, I'll improve. I'll be able to play like the people that I want to play like. And to some extent, I think that was true. I was practicing all those exercises and all these things that he had in his book. I think I could have spent a lot less time on it and practiced it more efficiently. So that's the first thing. So when I'm teaching someone now, I mean, most people aren't going to practice 6 or 7 hours, and there's nothing wrong with that. But I think if you learn to practice efficiently, you can not only do things like avoid injury. I mean, I've been very lucky. I've never actually had any playing related injuries, but I think you can. Put it this way, I could probably accomplish as much in 2 hours as I did back then in 6 hours, just by practicing more efficiently and not wasting so much time. I think what I would do differently now, and what I try and encourage people to do now, and I think Troy does this very well in his book. I mean, like, sure, there's lots of exercises and things, but there's also lots of musical content. And I think I've spent hours and hours in the past practicing exercises which may have benefited me in some way, but they weren't like anything I was ever going to play in solo. And I think there's a danger where it could almost get like, your playing becomes about practicing these exercises and doing that. But what I tell people now is, make your exercises things you're going to use in your solo. So for example, if you like someone like Slash's playing, or Michael Schenker, or whoever it is, like take little segments from their solos, other things you can A, use in your own playing, B, easily adapt into a few ideas of your own just by changing a couple of notes, and C, loop round and use as like ways to build your bending technique, or your picking, or your speed, or whatever it is you want to work on, but which you can then take and slot directly into your solo. Because playing chromatically up one string on the guitar is, can be good for your picking technique and all this stuff, but it's not something you're going to do very much in your actual playing. And I think where I went wrong is I wish I'd spent less time practicing exercises and obsessing about picking speed and this kind of stuff, and spent more time working on really building a vocabulary, really building things that I could use, and start to put the two together. I think if I'd done that, I would be a much better player now than I am, because I think I would have had that technical foundation, but also this vocabulary. It's really hard to say. Maybe I would be better than I am now, but you know what I mean. It's really easy to kind of to go down the exercise thing. It's almost like practicing, with playing tennis with a serving machine, endlessly returning serve, and never actually playing anyone. It can become a bit like that, I think, and I see that happen with students and things, where they're practicing endlessly playing bar chords and joining up bar chords, but they never actually put them into a song or something. You've got to practice using what you're working on. That's what I think. So I mean, when I got really into jazz, I went to music college and did a degree in jazz, and I would practice all my jazz scales and all this stuff for hours and hours and hours. And what I should have been doing is learning licks by Charlie Parker or Coltrane or whoever it was, and actually really building that vocabulary. I didn't learn the first time round. It took me after that to maybe learn. Because again, it doesn't give you the vocabulary. It gives you the tools. It gives you maybe the technique to play certain things. It doesn't give you the vocabulary. So I would say anyone who's maybe at the stage that we're talking about, when I started out, really think about, build your chops, build your technique, build your knowledge. It's almost like, I suppose, three things maybe. You've got like your playing technique, and that doesn't maybe need to be as good as people think. I think it maybe needs to be as good as to play what you're going to play now. Like, there's no point having Steve Vai's level of technique maybe if you haven't got any ideas to play which you're going to use it. It just becomes for the sake of it. So maybe it's like you're playing technique. What's holding you up when you go to play something? They're the things maybe you need to work on. Then I suppose you've got like your knowledge, so you can find your way around the guitar. Do you know your essential scales and your fretboard? And I mean, again, I've had people come to me and they're like, I need to learn all the modes, and they can't even play fluently, with something like the minor pentatonic scale. Like, where are you at now? Let's get that down. And then thirdly, I say, let's take all that, start working on a vocabulary. It can kind of suck that, because you go, I've worked with this and I've only got one idea, I can play with it. But you have to start somewhere. Start building some original ideas of your own, practice use them in your playing, so that the three things work really well together. I think that's a good approach to take.
Yeah, and in terms of a mental model, I would encourage people to think about this in terms of a Venn diagram, because you could have the scales, you have the language, and then you have the technique. And the more you get all of those to overlap with each other, the more overlap you have in that Venn diagram of them all coming together, the more rounded you'll be able to be. And just to tie up one thing too, the importance of vocabulary, it's like we all take speaking whatever our mother language is for granted. And it's like, if you want to speak the language of blues, if you want to speak the language of jazz, learning even some basic vocabulary, even if you're never going to play it in application, like we both know plenty of words we're not using in this conversation, right?
Yeah,
but we still
totally,
know all those words, and we can use them if we want to, but we choose not to. And then the way you talk to a 2-year-old is very different than the way you talk to a 20-year-old.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think, and the other thing to think about is, if you think about, say, take blues for example. Now you can go and you can learn loads of blues solos by everybody, but what you realise when you've done it for long enough is that most of them are playing the same thing most of the time. Let's start with that. Let's start with the stuff which you're going to use 80% of the time. It's like, if you've heard of the 80-20 rule, you know, like, what's the 20% of the blues vocabulary that you are going to use 80% of the time? That might be all you ever need. And I think that's the same with so many other styles. You know, you can get, especially with things like YouTube and all the resources, you know, I need to be able to tap, I need to be able to sweep pick, I need to know all this stuff. But actually, if you look at the players that are really sound, the players that a lot of people like, a lot of what they're doing is actually very simple. They're making it sound good. You know, you don't even notice the technique or whatever it is. You notice the fact that it moves you in some way. And I think there's a lesson in that, you know.
There is, for sure. And I think we should delineate between a hobby musician and someone who's just doing it for fun and someone who wants to do this professionally. Because for someone who wants it professionally, yes, you should practice all your scales. Yes, you should have technique where you can do 16th notes up to whatever, 140 BPM, 150 BPM. Like, you should have that in order to be able to be a professional. And even there, we could delineate further between, like, how do you want to specialize in being a professional? Because maybe you don't need that much technique. But for everyone to think about there being the bell curve of, you know, I'm getting the most benefit out of my technique right at the top. But then as I keep on doing more and more technique, it's the diminishing returns. And like James said, you can have the most phenomenal technique in the world, but not necessarily have something to say with it.
Yeah, it's so true. I mean, we see, you know, I mean, you see a lot of players like that, don't you? Where they've got, like, they're incredible players, and like there's a level of artistry to what they're doing, but there's nothing about their music that really grabs you the way, you know, maybe someone who hasn't got very much technique does. I don't know, someone like David Gilmour. I mean, I think his playing just sounds great. He hasn't got a lot of technique, but he's able to connect with people, and I think that's the thing, you know, where someone's got loads of technique. Can you connect with something through your music? I mean, I was lucky enough to see Alan Holdsworth play near here in a little art centre. There was about 50 people there. I mean, my jaw's on the floor. He's the most insane player there'll maybe ever be. The technique was flawless, but what I noticed was just how his music made me feel, you know. And yet you get someone who hasn't got very much technique. Again, someone like David Gilmour or any of these people, they can connect you in some way, just, you know, without so much technique. Because I think it's what they're playing in their music that really, that's what makes a connection, isn't it? You know, so it's easy to forget that, I think, when we're working on becoming a better guitar player, and you know, to actually think about keeping it really musical. It certainly happened to me. It becomes about the elements of playing guitar rather than about the elements of expressing music.
And sharing.
It's a trap.
And sharing.
Yeah, that's and playing stuff that just sounds good, that fits the music, and that people enjoy listening to, you know.
James, what would you say is the most important action a teacher can take to make their content clearer, more easily digested, and easily actionable? Like, that the student can easily take action on their content? Because I noticed from going through your book is the way that you present information is that it's immediately actionable. You can use it immediately. So can you talk a little bit about the philosophy with which you come to teaching with? And I'm going to leave that awkward little with as the end of that question, because I think you've got the gist of where I'm trying to go.
Yeah, sure. Well, I think because there's a couple of things. First of all, I've done a lot of private tuition. I've taught, I mean, you said in the bio, I've done, like, I think about 30,000 hours of one-on-one lessons over the years. I did that for years. It's really the only job I've ever had is just actually people coming to my house, or me going to, like, a music school or academy and teaching. So I've had a lot of one-on-one experience. However, I think right from the get-go, I think I was quite a natural kind of teacher. I found it quite easy to teach, and I think I was always quite a good problem solver. I could always look at someone and kind of think, yeah, they need to learn to do this. How can we, you know, how can I show them what they need to do so they can do it? So I think partly it's experience, and also I think thinking about it a lot and looking at my own way of learning, the things that have helped me to learn when I've almost taught myself something, I've found, that method works. I think to get a bit more into your question, I think the first thing is to sort of try to think, where's that student at now, and try and simplify everything so that they get what they need without any extra stuff they maybe don't need. I mean, in some of my books, I say, it's in my first theory book, for example, I did a series of 3. And in the first one, I might say something like, I'm talking about keys, okay? And I say, a key is basically a family of 7 chords, okay? And I kind of leave it at that. I say, sometimes you might find chords in your song which aren't in the key, but don't worry about that, we'll talk about that later, okay? Now, some people would go, oh, he's cut out a really important thing. You get lots of, the flat 6 chord and the flat 3 chord and all this stuff, but I deal with that later in the book, because in my mind, the person reading my first theory book, they don't need to know that. It's best for me to say, don't worry about that. When you understand this, that will make sense further down the road. So I think it's trying to think about the sort of the progressive journey that the player is on, or the reader, and trying to think, what do they need to know now so that they're progressing, so that things aren't confusing, and then something that we can stack a little bit more onto later on, so that eventually they end up with the whole picture. I think the problem is sometimes when we teach someone, or when we read a book or something, is we kind of get everything all at once. What I try and do in my books is kind of introduce things in a way so that the information is presented in a manageable way. So you start with the simpler stuff, you add a little bit of that on. It's a sort of a progressive thing. And just not overwhelming the students, and saying to them also, it's all right if you don't get all this first time round. No one ever does. I might have written this book, but it's taken me years to learn this. It wasn't like someone explained the cage system to me and next minute everything made sense and I was playing all over the fretboard. It just doesn't work like that. So in my cage book, for example, I sort of say, here's the 5 patterns of the minor pentatonic scale or whatever. Just stick with this one for now. Learn to use it. Learn a few bends. Learn a couple of things you can play. Here's 2 sample licks. I could give them 30 sample licks, but I don't. I'm like, they don't need 30. What they need is maybe 2 that they can use. And then, explore that a little bit and go on to the next thing. So I think it's kind of presenting what can be a big amount of information in little step-by-step ways. In terms of the actionable thing, I think is trying to make sure the student understands the point you're making, understands like why it's going to be useful for them, and for example, that could be saying, well, here are the chords in the key of C. Instead of saying here are the chords of the key of C, now we're going to look at the key of F or whatever, you could say here are the chords, just take 3 of them, mix them up. Can you find anything that sounds any good? And then the reader says, hey, I've just written like a little bit of a chord sequence here I could use for a song. So they've taken that information and they've kind of seen how they can use it in a practical way. And I think, they're probably the main things I try and do. It's just the other thing I really try and get across in my books is this idea of experimentation. And I think of, like an inventor in a shed in his garden, tinkering with all this stuff, trying to find, whatever he's trying to invent. Half of it doesn't work. Things blow up. Things go wrong. Things don't work at all. But it's almost like it's all the little failed experiments of how he actually ends up being able to create what he's trying to create. And I try and say to my readers, look, experiment with this. Take this lick, take this scale. What can you do with it? Don't worry if some of it's just rubbish. You'll find one little thing in there which you can actually start to use, and that'd be like a seed of a lot of other ideas. Don't be afraid to experiment. Don't be afraid to play things which you think really suck. It's only by doing that you have to go through that process, I think, to find the things that sound good and start building your playing. So think of the whole thing as like a game, an experiment. You're just tinkering around, seeing what you can discover with these musical tools. And I think if you take it with that attitude, it stops becoming something which is like, am I good at this? Am I doing it right? I'm not as good as so-and-so. And it kind of becomes a bit of an experiment and a game. And I think that's really healthy. That's how I try and look at my own playing now. Whereas at one time it was about being able to do this or being as good as so-and-so or showing everyone I could play this or play that. And now it's almost like it's a bit more of just a creative kind of experiment just for fun. And I think if you take that attitude, it can be really good, you know.
That's a beautiful mindset. Do you have any other mindset tips, James? Because that one is fire. Yeah, you have anything else mindset wise in terms of how to think about oneself during the learning process? What's like, okay, I'll get you a better question. I'm finding my way to a better question. James, what's your number one piece of advice for someone who is always telling themselves that they're bad and they're giving themselves a hard time and they're wasting time, focus, and energy and directing that into telling themselves that they're not doing a good job? What would you say to that student, and what's your mindset shift there?
Okay, I mean that's a great question, isn't it? I mean, and I think the first thing is we all beat ourselves up. I think, you know, even the greatest player ever, the greatest sportsman ever, the greatest writer, whatever, when you actually listen to some of these people talk, you realize that I think maybe we're all the same. We all want to be better. We all beat ourselves up, think we should be able to do that, think I've been practicing this thing for so long, why can't I do it? And I think the first thing is to accept that actually everyone feels like that, because I think that on its own can kind of help us. And I think it's not necessarily a lack of confidence when we do that. I think it's almost just sort of expecting we should be able to do this and we should be able to do that. So actually think about this answer. I think the one of the things to think about is that there's no one that can do everything. Okay, someone like Eric Johnson can come pretty close, but no, even he can't play like certain people. You know, no one can do everything. We don't need to be able to do everything to be a great musician. I really believe that, because I think there's a lot of pressure on us maybe these days to think we have to be able to do this. We have to be able to play jazz. We have to be able to play country. We have to be able to sweep pick. We have to be able to play the harmonic minor scale in 13 octaves. Or it's like, no, like, what do we need to be able to do?
13
play the music that we want to. It doesn't exist. Well, it does, but not on guitar. But you know what I mean. It's like we think we have to be able to do all this stuff because someone has maybe made us think that we have to be able to do all that stuff. So we beat ourselves up when we can't do all that stuff. And I think this is kind of an important thing to realise, is like, yeah, no one can do everything. So yeah, just ease off on yourself a little bit, you know. Just try and enjoy the journey, and it's about that. I think just like trying to enjoy it. Think of it as something you do for enjoyment. Make it creative. You know, like experiment with stuff. Again, you know, try and come up with some of your own ideas. Work them into your playing. I guess that's probably the main point, is to say that just remember that no one can do everything. So when we pummel ourselves because we can't do this certain thing, you know, we have to ease off. I remember like watching an instructional video by Joe Diorio, who was a great jazz player and a great teacher with a really beautiful mindset. I've listened to him talking a lot on YouTube and things, and read some of his books and stuff. And he had this instructional video that I had just when I started getting to jazz. And I really remember him saying, he said, you know, people come to me, they say to me, you know, oh, I practice 10 hours a day and I'm not getting better as quick as I want, and, you know, what's going wrong? And he said, you have to realise, he said, it happens when it's ready, not when you're ready. And I think that really sums it up, you know. And we've all seen that thing when you work your butt off on something, you're working really hard at learning to play this thing or be able to improvise over a certain chord sequence or whatever it is. And you just feel like you're banging your head against a wall, and you just kind of keep going. And then maybe you move on, and then 6 months down the road, you suddenly go, that stuff I was working on, it's worked its way into my playing. It's there now. So you have to kind of, rather than beat yourself up, you just have to keep putting one foot in front of the other, work on what you think you need to work on now, and just kind of have faith and have confidence that if you do that, the results will come. It's almost like if you go running every single day, or, you know, some days you might not feel like it, other days it's pouring with rain, some days you feel like you're not going anywhere, but if you just keep doing that, over time you're going to get fitter, you're going to start to be able to run more easily, longer, faster, whatever it is. And I think it's the same with this. It's the process of keeping going. I think that it's an obvious point, but I think that's really where it is. There is no magic. bullet like people will tell you in, you know, ads for guitar lessons and courses and stuff, you know, that there's things that, I mean, I think I've got some of my own magic bullets in that they'll speed things up and they'll help you progress quicker, but they're not magic bullets in terms of you just like pay your money and instantly you can do this thing. I mean, it just doesn't work like that, does it? It's that process of just trying to just keep going. And I think knowing that it's not about being able to play X or do X, it's actually just about keeping going. And if we do that, we have to have that confidence to know that eventually we will be able to do this thing. And I think it's really important to remember that, like, today's thing that we can play easily, that we do all the time, that we're sick to death of playing, it's the thing we always play and we never play anything new. Well, that was yesterday's thing that we really wanted to be able to play. Do you know what I'm saying? It's like the stuff we do now, it didn't just come from nowhere. The things we can do, the things we can play easily, they're the things that once upon a time we were practicing, we were working on them. And so we've moved along, and it's just about stacking on that, but just keeping going, really. And I think any great player would say exactly the same. And you know, all the great players, they still work on their playing constantly, don't they? You know, it's just what we all do.
I want to bring up something that you said in that insightful answer, which was to find your own sound. And that's the fourth or fifth. I don't remember how many circles we had in our Venn diagram about 20 minutes ago, but that would be the other circle, is to also sound like you. So James, could you talk about the process of going through learning how to play like other people in order to learn to play like yourself?
I think I do play like me. I don't think it's, maybe not, I'm not saying it's a massive, but my style of playing is massively distinctive. Like, you know, some people, you hear them and you can instantly recognize them, but I do think I have developed some kind of style of my own. I think there's a couple of things. I think first of all is really zeroing in on a couple of players or one player who just does something that connects with you. You know, like when we start playing, we all have. I've listened to hundreds of different guitar players over the years, but there's just a couple who I can think when I heard them, they had some kind of impact, and they've maybe impacted my playing now more than other people who I've listened to whose music I might enjoy. When I started playing, and I was into sort of rock and metal type stuff when I started out, I got really into George Lynch's playing. I still love his playing. Some of what he does is much better than other stuff he's done, but I just think he's a killer player. And there's something about the spirit in his playing. I think the energy and the fact that he plays stuff like he really sounds like he really means it. And I think the point I'm making is I think it's important to kind of latch onto some players who really inspire you, who you think you want to play like them. And you might not be able to play like them, their stuff might be too difficult, but you don't even have to try and play like them. I think it's almost like, I want some of what they've got in my playing. How can I do this? You know, maybe I should try and improvise or just fool around, try and play some things that kind of sound a little bit like them without actually copying them. So you kind of, you know, you're taking some of what you hear in their playing and trying to do it yourself. I suppose that's a good approach to take, rather than directly copying them. And actually the interesting thing to talk about, you know, George Lynch as an example, I mean, is I've heard him interviewed, and it's basically what he did. He said I never really copied anyone. I couldn't play the stuff I was trying to copy, you know, so I just kind of got as close as I could, and that was fine. And I think that's kind of a good idea, really. You know, like, if you want to play like John Scofield or someone, you know, you can work out his licks and you can copy and things, but really, what's the point in just sounding like him? Maybe take some of the sort of slightly awkward phrasing and the cool rhythmic ideas that someone like him does, and just try and work that in your own way. And I think it takes this, again, this is something I wish I'd done more of. It comes back to this experimentation and this creativity thing. You know, take a little bit of what these guys do whose playing you really love, and then kind of put it through the mincer and see if you can come up with something which is a little bit like it, but without just totally copying it. And then I think another important part of this is to have confidence that it's any good, because we've all come up with riffs or songs or solos or books or whatever it is we create, and we thought, well, this can't be much good because I'm the one who created it. And I think we have to we might feel that we have to kind of cast that aside and say, yeah, well, this is fine. I made this myself. It's worth something, and stick with that, because I think any great player must have done that. If you think of, imagine like Eddie Van Halen, back in the day, when someone told him, no, you can't play with two hands on the fretboard. Or imagine Wes Montgomery when someone said, no, you can't play guitar with your thumb. That's a stupid idea. Use this pick. Like, two of the main most innovative guitar players ever, they may never have, we may not even know who they were. So I think it's having this confidence that you've created something and it is good. It might be raw, it might not sound as good as you're going to get it, but just have the confidence that there's something here, I can work with this, rather than binning it because because you came up with it. I think and that's something, I think it takes confidence to do that, but I think that can be really important. And don't judge it too much. See it as a work in progress. This is a starting point. It's an idea, something I can work with. I'm going to keep working on it, rather than saying, no, it's not good enough, I'm going to bin the whole idea. It reflects where you are now. You can build on it, add to it.
A quick translation for our American listeners: binning it would be throwing it in the trash. I have the advantage of being raised by an Englishman, so I'm tracking everything that's going on, but just to go ahead and filter that through for the
cool,
binning.
Yeah.
James, those are all my questions for you. Is there anything that we talked about that we didn't talk about that you think we should? Is there any points you think we have missed? We've done quite a, I think, healthy overview of quite a few things. Is there anything you'd like to talk about more? Anything you think we should hit before we call it a day?
Yeah, I suppose what I would say is to really, I'd just like to reinforce for your listeners some of the things I've learned from all my teaching, and I have to a lot of people. I've seen a lot of, and I've learned a lot from myself from having lessons over the years. I haven't had lessons for many years now, but I was lucky to have a couple of really good teachers. One in particular, when I was studying jazz at college, I was lucky to have a really good, insightful teacher. And I think a couple of things I would like to say is really think about what it is you need to know and what you need to be able to do to play the way you hear yourself playing in your head. Actually, this kind of ties in with the previous question a bit. I think I've always had a bit of an idea of how I wanted to sound, and it's maybe not a really concrete sound, but it's kind of a little bit of an idea, some nice space, some slightly little surprises, some unexpected little things in there. It's very abstract, but it's a bit of an idea of how I like my playing to sound. So I think that can be useful as for people to think, how do I want to sound roughly? What do I need to know to be able to do that? So if someone really wants to sound like, if they love B.B. King, and they don't want to sound exactly like him, but they want to be, well, I kind of want to be a little bit like B.B. King. Well, you don't need to know the Phrygian mode or something. I mean, you just don't need to. So think about, boil it down. What's someone like him doing most of the time? And focus on that. Because what you realise when like you and me, you've been playing for a long time and you start to work and you've maybe studied. I've never been one for learning lots of other people's solos and things, but I've done so much teaching, I've had to work out lots of things, and what you realise is that a lot of people are pretty much doing the same thing. They're just kind of presenting it in a slightly different way. So, for example, if you're want to play like B.B. King, you might find that if you learnt 20 classic B.B. King type licks, and then you took each one of those and you found 3 or 4 little variations, or you really went inside that lick and learned what you can do with it, you could sound amazing. You don't need to know all the scales, you don't need to know all this stuff. Think about what do you need to be able to play the way you want to play, and depending on how you want to play, it's going to be maybe more complicated than than others. So it depends what you need. But don't think about what someone like me tells you everyone needs to know, because I don't know. It depends what you want to play. Think about that. The other thing I would really say, which I've come up time and time again in my teaching and with my own playing, is just, and I think this is a really empowering thing for people to hear, is the power of the basics. And by basics, I mean not whether you can sweep pick arpeggios and 3 octaves. Can you play a lick with such a strong rhythm that the listener feels it? Is there a groove to your playing? That's the stuff that people really hear. Why do people, when you go to gigs, people that aren't musicians, they love drum solos, don't they? They love it when everything stops and the drummer, they love it. You go to like a carnival or a festival and there's people drumming, everyone really gets off on that stuff. It's the rhythm. But we never really talk about that with guitar players. I mean, everyone knows what rhythm guitar is, but when was the last time you went, you went on a video on YouTube and someone's saying, let's work on getting your timing really well when you improvise? No one really talks about that stuff. It's a basic concept, but it's incredibly powerful. So really focus on the basics, getting a basic vocabulary down in whatever style you want, and then finding lots of ways to vary that vocabulary rather than necessarily keep on adding tons more to it. Really learn how to use it, because some of the greatest music ever on guitar has been created by people who don't have an extensive vocabulary. They've just learned how to use it well enough to connect with their listener. Again, someone like David Gilmour or someone, people really connect with his music. Someone like Slash, people, we all know that there's a lot of players that are much better guitar players than someone like Slash, but what he does connects with people. He's great at playing Slash. People often say, oh no, I think Slash is really overrated, and I would say, yeah, he's great at being Slash. No one could be Slash better than him. He's got his own thing. People love his music, but again, a lot of what he does is quite basic, but he's able to present it in a way that sounds great and works great for him. So really, I think really doubling down on the basics, getting really solid and looking at how to use it. I think if people do that, it's really surprising how far you can go with those things. And I suppose the third thing I would say, having done a lot of improvising and the whole jazz thing, I did that for about 10 years, didn't really play anything else but that. There's the little things that no one really talks about, which are incredibly powerful. For example, if you're soloing, if you're improvising, things like using some repetition, like playing a lick, playing it again, but maybe with a bit of variation. These simple things, trying to think of playing something that follows on from what you just played, because so often we're like hot lick number 1, hot lick number 2, hot lick number 3, and it doesn't make any sense. Think about that, trying to play something that follows on from what you just played, leaving spaces that you're playing. So these are some of the things that I found really influential in my development as a player, is actually forcing myself to leave more space. And these simple things that no one ever talks about are so incredibly powerful. It's amazing. So yeah, this is hopefully just a few closing tips that I've found useful, which hopefully your listeners will maybe find useful.
Regardless of instrument or musical discipline, we've covered so many valuable principles here today with James. James, thank you for being so generous with your time, your knowledge, for coming on, sharing. Everyone go check out jamesshipway.com. Links for that will be in the video description and in the show notes if you are on audio. James, thank you so very much for joining us today.
That's a pleasure, Dan. Great to be on the show. Have a great day.